The passage is about British colonialism, British rule, and how it affected India. And let's quickly summarize the passage. One of the most common debates I hear about India is whether British colonialism has been good and or bad for the country's economic prospects. Was British colonialism good for us or bad for us economically? Defenders of British rule often cite the construction of the railroads or the spread of the English language, but as time passes, the evidence mounts that India would have been much better off on its own. This paragraph gives you the main idea. Was the British rule good for us in terms of economic prospects? Some say yes, yes, they built railroads and gave us the English language. Others point out that no, we would have been better off. We would have probably got all this and done even better off on our own without the long colonial uh, rule that happened. That's of relevance for the shouting match, but it also bears on how optimistic we should be about India today. Of course, there are always two sides to think, but the author says, but there's also this debate also tells has influences how optimistic we should be about India today. If you view the colonial period as a harmful aberration, just a deviation, a harmful deviation, abnormality, irregularity, you will tend to think of India as catch up as it leaves those distortions behind. So, India was progressing, the colonial rule happened, that was a harmful aberration. Now we leave it behind and move on. Conversely, if you see British rule as a plus, you may worry that India may eventually lose some of that inherited dynamism. If you think British rule was bad, you look at it as a momentary or a aberration that happened in our history, and you now leave that distortion and you move ahead. But if you think of the British rule as a positive influence on India, then you'll start worrying, oh, we lose some of those positive effects, some of that inherited dynamism. Consider living standards in the, then he starts giving examples. Consider living standards in the colonial period. For much of the 18th and early 19th centuries, under British rule, Indian economic performance was mediocre at best. It has been estimated that the yearly agriculture wage was higher in 1810 than in 1946. Before the British rule, the yearly agriculture wage was higher in 1810, and by the time Britain left India in 1946, the average agriculture wage was down. It's difficult to prove how much of that decline was because of the British, but it's hardly a ringing endorsement. Now, the British will defend themselves saying, oh, that's not because of the British rule. Maybe, there were droughts and there were other things, but he says it's not an endorsement of the British rule either. So you can't cite agricultural wage as a positive point of the British rule. Okay, considering that agricultural wage was way below in 1946 than it was in 1810. Economic performance picked up in the latter part of 19th century. Yet, India was still desperately poor at the time of independence in 1948, with a literacy rate of only 16%. When the British left India, India was desperately poor. India had only a 16% literacy. Since then, India has begun to catch up to the West. After that, India is busy trying to run and catch up with the West in terms of development, in terms of literacy. And after the reforms of the 19th century, 1990s, the country has often grown at 6 to 8%. After 1990s, with liberalization of the economy, the country has grown at the rate of 6 to 8%, a rate never possible under British rule. So the growth rate was way less during the British rule. Sorry, I need to go. One of the big difference in the post-colonial period is that a democratic Indian government endeavored to invest more in the health and education of more citizens, however imperfectly that was implemented. So the author is a little realistic here. He says, in the post-colonial period, after the Brits left us, a democratic Indian government tried to invest more in terms of the health and education of more citizens. It may not have implemented it in the best possible way, but it tried. The British, in contrast, supplied fewer public schools, and too often the expenditures were directed towards defending British rule, extracting revenue, or ensuring India as a captive market for British goods. The British didn't have supplied fewer public goods, and often the expenditure was directed towards defending the British rule. And they also extracted revenue. They, their reasons were also pretty selfish. It was used to defend the British rule, it was used to extract revenue, or it was used to have India as a captive market because they got British goods. And so the goods were they were not selling those goods to us because they wanted us to develop. They were selling those goods to us because they had a captive market in our country. So their goods could be sold to us. The deindustrialization of India was a conscious British policy from the 18th century onward. So they deindustrialized India as a conscious policy. In 2017, we have a good understanding of how hard it can be for from communities to recover from the loss of manufacturing jobs. The British deliberately did that. And in 2017, after 2017, we realized how difficult it is to recover from the loss of manufacturing jobs. When the manufacturing sector doesn't do well, it's difficult to get back to the earlier level. Another possible comparison is between British rule India and India's native states. British rule India, and we also had India's native states, the territories and principalities, where British involvement in direct rule was minimal. So you had British rule over the rest of the states, and you have native states where territories, principalities ruled by kings and such people who where the British involvement in direct rule of these native states was minimal. So he's drawing a comparison between states ruled by Britain and the native states and principalities. What does the comparison show? Tata Steel put India's first modern steel plant in Jamshedpur, a tributary outside of British rule. He's giving you examples. British rule covered a lot of areas. Tata Steel started its first steel plant in an area not under direct British rule. A study found that the independent areas had better performance in terms of education and healthcare during the post-colonial era. And these independent areas did better in education and in health in the post-colonial era. What then of the positive British contribution? Oh, you're sitting and saying all the negatives. What about the positive contribution? What are the author's thoughts on this? The English language and the railroads and irrigation canals do count. Of course, they gave us English, they gave us railroads, and they gave us canals. But India could have obtained some of those gains through trade and cross-cultural exchange. India could have gained these anyways through trade, through cross-cultural exchange. For all the wanted advantage of English, all this boasting that you're doing about English, by many estimates, only about 10% of the Indian population can speak the language today. We're talking of British giving us English language, but what percentage of Indians speak English? Only 10% of India can speak the language today. That is another way of saying that the British rulers invested only small amounts in public goods and education. This shows that they didn't really invest much in public goods and education. Which one of the following statements best describes what the passage is about? What's the main point of the passage? How would you describe the passage in one sentence? The deleterious effects of British rule in India. Is it all about the negatives, and has he left it at that? No, he has talked about the negatives, he's talked about the positives, but also talked about, in the beginning, talked about India's performance in the post-colonial Britain, right? So it's not necessarily only about deleterious effects. That's a strong word. The conundrum of British rule, the confusion, the puzzle that was British rule. There's no conundrum here. He said British rule did this clearly. There was no confusion about British rule in India. There's no puzzle about it. There's no puzzle or confusion about it. So B is wrong. A discourse. Is it a discourse? First of all, it's an article. So can you call it a discourse? A lengthy, detailed explanation of the disadvantages of British rule in India. If he had at least called it a discourse on British rule in India, it might have been partially correct. Right? It's not long enough to be called a discourse, and it's not only about the disadvantages of the British rule. It talked about both, and it also talked a little bit about what India might have been had it not been for the British rule. So, an objective account of the British rule in India. They did this, people think this, people think that. So, largely objective, though at times the author tends towards critical. So, largely an objective account of the British rule in India.